Hello. Hi, everyone. Welcome to MICE, the Massachusetts Independent Comics Expo. I'm your host, Jordan Stillman, and this panel is titled What's New in Graphic Memoir. Before we get started, I just want to take a minute to thank our co-presenter for this program, the Boston Book Festival. The Boston Book Festival is running dozens of free online programs throughout the month of October, featuring over 150 authors, plus a virtual marketplace with 70 vendors. Visit bostonbookfest.org for a schedule of events. And next, I would like to say thank you so much to all of our arts advocates. These are major contributors who help sustain MICE and allow the show to grow year after year. So thanks so much. Finally, MICE is produced by the Boston Comic Arts Foundation, a 501c3 nonprofit charitable organization that funds comic art festivals, individual artists, and educational programs for the greater Boston community. If you like what we're doing here, please consider making a donation today using the donate button in this session. So at the bottom of the screen, you'll see a button labeled Ask a Question. Please use that button to ask or vote up any questions that you may have throughout the session. Also, feel free to use the chat feature to say hello. We'd love to hear from you. Finally, we will also be streaming this panel to our Facebook page at facebook.com/MICEXPO for audience members who'd like to use automatic closed captioning function that Facebook Live offers. The panel will be available there. And now I would like to introduce our moderator, A. David Lewis. He is an Eisner Award-nominated author and an editor. Dr. Lewis is a program coordinator at the Massachusetts College of Pharmacy and Health Sciences University School of Healthcare Business, where his teaching and research both focus on graphic medicine, specifically the depiction of cancer in comic books and graphic novels. So thank you, A. David Lewis. Please take it away.
Thank you so much, Jordan. Thank you to MICE and the organization overall. It's a pleasure to be here and to kick things off with what's new in graphic memoir with 3, not 2. You may only see 2 on your screen at the moment, but we will actually be having 3 terrific panelists here, beginning, of course, with Sophie Yanow and Joel Christian Gill. And we will also shortly be joined by Georgia Weber. So that I am not embarrassing them unduly, I'm going to ask my kind panelists here if they'd offer their own words on what they do, who they are, and how they label themselves, starting with Sophie. Sophie, welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm Sophie Yanow. I'm a cartoonist. I live in the San Francisco Bay Area. My new book, The Contradictions, just came out a few weeks ago with Drawn and Quarterly. I used to teach at the Center for Cartoon Studies and also at the New Hampshire Institute of Art for a moment with Joel. Yeah, my book, The Contradictions, I've done quite a bit of memoir, but this book is actually autofiction. So looking forward to talking about the sort of differences between the forms.
Autofiction, that's not car fiction. That's autobiographical fiction.
Essentially.
Okay, we'll be diving into that shortly. But first, Joel, please introduce yourselves to the kind folks.
Unmute myself for a second. My name is Joel Christian Gill. I am an associate professor in illustration at Massachusetts College of Art and Design, former chair of the comic arts department at an institution whose name I will not give. I am the author of a number of nonfiction comics, Strange Fruit, Uncelebrated Narratives from Black History, Tales from the Talented Tenth, and my most recent book, Fights, One Boy's Triumph Over Violence, is a memoir about me growing up with violence and abuse and trauma and how I ultimately survived that. I currently live in White Conda, which is what I affectionately call New Boston, New Hampshire. White Conda, like Wakanda is this, White Conda is this, so it makes a W, like you do this when you see people. So it's like, hey, that's where I am right now, and I'm in White Conda.
Do you encourage us to do that, or are you suggesting we maybe should hold off?
It's entirely up to you. If you want to
Okay.
start like putting the white conda sign up, you can do that because that's what it is.
Fantastic. And as I did mention, we are still connecting with. I don't know if we have Georgia by audio. Georgia, are you with us yet? Okay, Georgia Weber is going to be joining us later in this panel. And Sophie sort of jumped to my first question, which is, what is graphic memoir, and is that actually what you're doing?
You want me to address?
I think you have to go first this time. I'm sorry.
Sure. So I think that memoir is itself a bit of a fluid category.
Mm-hmm.
But for memoir, for me, if I'm going to call something memoir, I personally don't think that characters that are like amalgams necessarily fit the category for me. So everything that I've done that's memoir has been more or less, reality as I feel that I lived it. Of course, that's parsed through my own lens. So it's going to have a bias and through the haze of memory. But autofiction, like what I'm doing with this book, there are most of the characters, aside from myself, well, essentially because I'm putting myself into some fictional situations, my character is fictional as well. But the character itself is based on me. And I wanted to do something, I called it autofiction because it's based on a time period in my life where I was doing certain things like hitchhiking and some of the things that go on in the book. And I did study abroad in France. And, but the characters are not, based on a particular individual. A lot of it will be, someone who maybe I have a conversation with this character and I did have that conversation with somebody, but actually it was an old man in Paris, nothing to do with that specific individual. Okay. So I started out thinking, oh, maybe I'm going to do a memoir about this time. But then when I talked to some of the folks in that who I did study abroad with, I kind of like after talking to them and just trying to figure out what I wanted to do with the book, I decided to take it in a fictional direction. So
okay.
Yeah.
So given that sort of reshaping of the categories, Joel, let me ask you, are you dealing in graphic memoir? Are you dealing in what Sophie's calling autofiction, or do you put fights in an entirely separate category? Before I get your answer, let me welcome Georgia Weber. Georgia, pleasure to see you. Pleasure to hear you.
Thank you.
We've just started off the conversation with what graphic memoir is and if that's what each one of your works actually are. So, Joel, the question goes to you, sir.
Fights is definitely a memoir, although characters are amalgams and things were changed mostly because so there's a couple of things in this that I didn't want to have to get into, which was like fighting people who did terrible things to me when I was a kid and having to justify those things. While, privately, I'm perfectly fine with doing that. Like, I have no problem with going after the people and saying, you did this crap to me when I was a kid.
Sure.
It was something that I didn't want to put the rest of my family through. So a lot of the characters are amalgams. So every situation that happens in fights, every fight, every emotional abuse and trauma and those things are all things that actually happened, but they didn't necessarily happen. They didn't happen. They weren't as logically connected. So like that's part of the process of memoir is, and I think is what Sophie said that I think is really important is that it's all through my own lens. And so one of the things that when I first started drawing fights, which was years ago, I had drawn the first chapter and it was just like. Actually, it wasn't even the first chapter. It was like one section of the book that I was just like a memory that I had really thoroughly. It's the memory of me and my mom walking down the street and seeing the man on the side of the road, the man who I'm never really thought if he was dead or not. So I drew that whole scene. And then I was talking to James Sturm at the Boston Book Festival, and I showed it to him, and he was just like, we had this conversation. He was like, memoir is not biography. It's not like this direct fact. Like this thing is an exact fact. This thing is an exact fact. So what I tried to do was only rely on my memories of these situations and make sure that it was clear that what I was saying was how I remembered them. So everything in that book is exactly how I remember it. And if anybody has said, like my friend Mike, who's in the book, who's in prison for double murder, he and I talk on a regular basis. And one of the things that I've written about in the book, he hasn't read the book yet because it was hard for me to get it to him. But one of the things that he remembers, like the whole Cabbage Patch Doll scene in the book, if you've read it, then you know the whole Cabbage Patch Doll scene. Like he remembers that. And it was funny because unprompted, he actually started talking to me about it once when we were on the phone. So there are things in there that happen exactly the way I remember them, but I'm positive that they don't, like the other people that were involved would remember them a different way. And that's just the nature of memory in general. Like people remember things different way. We remember sitting in different places, wearing different things, having different conversation, the timeline, whether it's day or night. So like all of those things are filtered through me. So while I would attest to everything happening the way it happened in the book, mm-hmm. I'm positive that some of the things happened a little differently.
Memory must skew something.
Yeah, actually, yeah, exactly. Memory. Memoirs are memory, not biography. Yeah. It's not me, going and polling my mom and saying, okay, when did we go to start staying with grandma? What year was it? When did that happen? It's just like, I remember these things happening. So I'm putting them in that order. So
before I put the question to Georgia, and Georgia has 2 volumes perhaps to speak about here. Let me mention to people that are joining us, we're welcome again if you're coming at all late to the panel. We're talking about graphic memoir, and we will be taking your questions shortly. If you put them in the chat, they will be followed in the Ask a Question area. So stay tuned for the Q&A to open up. But first, hi, Georgia.
Hi.
If you don't mind, would you talk to us about, and this is in terms of both of the works you have, Dancing After 10, which is not about you necessarily, it's a collaboration, but mm-hmm. Dumb is about, well, a woman named Georgia who went through something like yourself. Could you tell me and differentiate maybe what graphic memoir is to you and whether these qualify?
Yeah, I mean, I think these two are squarely in the category of graphic memoir. We decided to even put it on the cover of both of them. Mine is much more direct for me to experience that way and to make decisions like Joel was talking about or Sophie was talking about, what my memory of that was, what my experience of that was, and then sharing my narrative of it, which is going to be different from, the people around me, what they perceived or what they thought of, or how they were interacting. So I use people as amalgams as well. I tried to represent some of my friends loosely so that they could see themselves as supportive characters in the work. Sure. But I didn't want to fact check with them, is this how the conversation went? It was really supposed to be about my experience. Sure. Which also is very much to allow or invite or like make space for someone else who's having their own experience to recognize that. Like, I think if we go too far in the direction of trying to fact check other people's perceptions of what was going on, then it might actually break the connection between my story that I'm trying to tell and someone else's individual internal story. Because probably our internal stories are more similar than the version of my story that has other voices interjecting. And I kind of think that there's like an intimacy to it when it's just the way I saw it, the way I felt it, the way I remember it. And knowing that there's a lot of like washy versions of truth that exist within that and around that. But this was a whole other challenge working with Vivian on her memoir, because Vivian has that internal experience that I can only access as she's pulling it out. And she's pulling it out not through directly putting it on a page. Like, she wasn't writing things to give to me so that I would just like draw it and make what she imagined real or make what she described into something visual. It was more hearing her stories and then trying to be inside of them with her enough to share the impression of it, not just the pictures that would tell you what happened, but actually her impressions of it and her feelings of it. And at the same time, constantly recognize that this visual object, this story that we've created, it's inescapable, knowing the contents of the book and knowing the premise of the book. It's inescapable that the reader already knows Vivian didn't do all of this herself. So I could never even pretend that I wasn't there doing that. And I'm in the book just at the end as a way to acknowledge that this was a collaborative process. This was a process that involved me interpreting. I am another fallible human who's trying to find that inner world of another person, which is, you know, sort of impossible and also very possible, but in ways that feel a bit more magical or surreal. So yeah, I had two like very, very different experiences of identifying truth and memory, and yeah, how they work differently for different people.
I hope you'll excuse we're living in, of course, a pandemic panel time. If you're hearing any ambient noise outside or through any of our speakers, please do excuse that. But Georgia, thank you for that response. I was sort of hoping to open to the whole panel this question of, we can look at this in two different directions. We can look at this from the artist's perspective, the person that is, and we have the three of you here today to answer that, or from the audience perspective. But what is the value of either graphic memoir or autofiction or self-report? Georgia, when I look at yours, I also think of what in graphic medicine we call graphic pathographies. That comic books and graphic novels that relate certain patient conditions. Now, I'm wondering, both for the authors and creators, what the value of graphic memoir is. Is it a cathartic experience? Is it a re-traumatizing experience? And then separately, what do you see the value being to have this out in the world, for this to be connecting with authors, with audience members? And maybe we can go in reverse order this time. Georgia, if you wouldn't mind starting it.
Sure. You know, I think it can be both and all
Sure.
of the things you sort of hinted to in that spectrum of like, is this cathartic or is this re-traumatizing? Because there's a certain amount of, I guess, like the drive to express something being fulfilled. Sure, that feels cathartic, but it's very hard to express something without confronting it. And some of the things you're trying to talk about, that confrontation may feel more or less painful, more or less like real in the moment. And I think I've come to recognize that it's good to have the things that come out raw, because people are experiencing their emotions in that raw way as much as they are benefiting from something that's more polished and given with perspective. So finding a version of a creative process that involves like working raw images out, working raw ideas out, and then giving them some space and giving yourself some care, and then coming back to them and seeing like, what of this still has value outside of that moment? And what can I then like transform this into? Because it's kind of an act of demonstrating how someone could work through something. Like doing it, producing something is sort of showing another person like, these feelings are in me too. Like this is something maybe you're experiencing as well. And here's a way that I've worked with it. So there are ways to work with it. This was mine. This is how I did it. And that's kind of, I mean, that's not such a direct like message from any of the books that I've written, but it is something I've come to recognize, is just that we do things, and that it in itself has a benefit of demonstrating to other people who are lost and trying to figure things out and going through their own experiences that there are many ways to move through that. And like, here's mine, and I'm putting it out there.
Okay. Joel, what's your reaction to my, far-reaching question here, both what graphic memoir does for you as a creator and artist, and then what you hope it does or what it should do for audience members?
So I think what I was trying to do, Kathy Johnson said this on a podcast that she, when she reviewed, she and someone else, and I forget who it was, but they reviewed fights. And she said this thing that I thought was really profound. And it was about this idea with children's literature and how we either make things that are mirrors or windows. And so a mirror is something for someone who has gone through a thing and they can see themselves. And a window is for people who's not gone through that and can't really see themselves. And so when I'm thinking, when I started writing fights, it was just like it's artist expression, right? Like this is an idea that I want to express a story about myself, and I thought it was important. And then originally, I actually started out with this idea of making it a fictionalized version of myself, and it turned into a more accurate portrayal because I felt like it was important for me as a Black, cisgendered straight man to talk about sexual abuse so that people could see that that's a thing that happens to men too. And it doesn't make me anything, right? I am not what happened to me. I am something different than what happened to me. And so I often tell people that this is a love letter to kids who are like me growing up so that they can see that there's another option out there. There's someone else you could turn into. And I also made it for people who see kids like that, who work with kids like this on a regular basis so that they can have some empathy with the idea of these kids don't, and I say this all the time. So if you've heard me talk at any other point, you've heard me say that psychopaths are rare. And so when you see a kid acting out, they're not just automatically a psychopath. Like you don't know what that kid went through between waking up at 6 a.m. and 8 o'clock when they got to school. They could have gone through so much trauma, but just in a normal, that's just a normal day for them. So by the time they get to school, they're acting out with the other kids. They're like acting out with you. They're, all of these different things like that, all of that stuff could happen. So when I wrote Fights and thinking about that, when it, all of my work is really about the idea of how we build empathy in a community. And I think that's, you can take racism and homophobia and all this other stuff away, like just remove that. People don't understand. They are not empathetic to other people, right? We all know those people. The great uncle who was a racist or a homophobe that met their daughter or met their daughter's partner and now keeps a picture of them in their house, we all know those people, right? Because they have this idea in their head that, my daughter is marrying a Black man and he's like those people, but then he meets them and then all of a sudden he loves these grandchildren and wants to take them to every store that he goes to and show off these grandchildren, right? And that's like empathy, right? We need to do this on a macro level. And so Fights for me was like doing that. All of my work is about doing that, showing that, trying to build empathy on a macro level. I have somewhat of a platform, and I think it's really important for me to show that we are all way more alike than we are different. There are a lot of men out there who are not talking about sexual abuse and not speaking about it. So everybody else who's had this happen to them are sitting in a room by themselves thinking, this has only happened to me. There are a lot of children out there who've gone through trauma who don't know that they are not special in that sense. They are special people. Their problems aren't special. Like we all go through those things. And the more we do that, studies have shown that if you want to change somebody's mind, you don't tell them facts and fiction. You tell them stories about your life. You tell them that I went through this, that I had to make the decision to do something difficult in a situation so that's how you change people's mind, not by giving them facts and fiction, facts and nonfiction and reports and links. It's about sharing a story, right? People, they found that if you were someone who was against gay marriage and you actually showed up at somebody's house and said, I am personally in a gay marriage and my partner is of the same sex as me, that typically helps to change that person's mind, right?
Sure.
So I think that's what I was trying to do with Fights. I'm gonna get off my soapbox now. I don't want to monopolize Fights.
No, it's
keep going.
It's a good soapbox. It's a noble one, and I agree with you to a large extent that it hasn't been seen or hasn't been delivered to people who might need it, or as you said specifically, might be working with children who are experiencing something similar or parallel. Sophie, I want to put the question to you. Are there mirrors and windows operating with your own work? How do you intend? And authorial intent is a flawed thing. but how do you intend for this to work with your audiences, and how is the contradictions working for you?
I think, I mean, a lot of what Joel said, I kind of echo, even though my book doesn't touch on maybe as a serious topic, but I didn't want to do just a purely fictional book, I think, because I wanted to be able to say, like, okay, this is not 100% true, you know, or I don't know what percent true, you know, really happened. But like, this character is the one who is the me character. And I don't want you to be thinking, oh, wait, is the author that character? Is the author that character? It's like, no, I'm not doing a thing also where the different characters are aspects of myself. It's like the different characters are things based on things that I have encountered, and then, you know, my reactions to them. And so like the story kind of deals with the Sophie character trying to figure out like how she should be in the world, and sort of following somebody else's idea of what that might be. And, you know, the story takes place in sort of a brief period with the hitchhiking trip, and over the course of a few months, the whole thing. But, you know, in reality, that emotional arc for me, like I spent years really in the shadow of other people, sort of trying to figure out, you know, how should I be in the world, and really like beating myself up about the decisions that I was making, even though, you know, I was having trouble adhering to sort of dogma that I felt was sort of handed down by some of my peers who I like respected and wanted to be like. So I feel like that's what I wanted to reflect. And so that was maybe the reason that felt important to do it as autofiction and not just do a straight fictional work. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. That makes a great deal of sense. And as we each discuss basically what went into the recipe of each of your works, I'm curious about the ingredients. More specifically, what sort of graphic memoir either informed or inspired or just occupied any space in your head prior to this? Are there standout works by any other artists that you would point to as you would love to have this book of yours next to theirs on a shelf? Or I'm gonna, so that this doesn't become messy, I'm gonna say you can't name each other. I'm gonna say you can't name each other. But if your work was to be on a panel with some other graphic memoir that you read previously, what would that be, and why? Why does it occupy that space so largely with graphic memoir for you? This can be anyone. I am not establishing an order. Ha ha.
Fun Home would be one that I think I would put up there, mine, specifically because what Alison Bechdel was doing with her work, exploring things that I think people hadn't really talked about at the time when it came out. But the other book that I think was really inspirational for me when I started to make fights more about my real life as opposed to a fictionalized version of my life was Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me. And if you haven't read that book, you know, he talks about, excuse me, he talks about things, and Ta-Nehisi Coates and I are about the same age. He's from Baltimore. I'm from Southwestern Virginia. So we grew up at the same time, right during the middle of the crack boom. And things that he articulated in that book were things that I had never really thought about because they were just a part of life. And it was between that and then working in academia. And there was this thing that happened where in my little school, somebody had been mugged, and somebody had pulled a gun on them, right? And that's a traumatic thing. And I'm not saying one person getting a gun pulled on them is terrible, right? But this was over a 5-year period, and I think it had happened one time, which would be good in the context of like crime and safety, right? And somebody was talking about it, and I was like, in a meeting, and I was like, I've had a gun pulled on me a number of times because I didn't think it was that big of a deal. And the look on everybody else's faces were shocked, and I was just like, oh yeah, that's right. That's not normal for everybody. Like everybody doesn't have a gun pulled on them, right? And Ta-Nehisi Coates talked about the idea of like not going to certain neighborhoods. And I wasn't in a gang or anything, but there were just certain places I didn't go because I had beef with some dude who lived over there, drug dealer that lived over there, and I could get shot or killed or jumped, or I wouldn't go to a party unless I had multiple people with me. And so like he said that, and it was just like, oh yeah, like I was in constant fear, but it was so embedded. It was just like, you know, you want to go over to this mall? And I'm just like, no, we're going to go downtown, right? Because it wasn't like I thought, like, I can't go to that mall because the dude over there is going to pull a gun on me and I might die. It was just like, I'm going to go to this one over here because it was safer and whatever, right? So, you know, those two, I think those two books, and also Raina Telgemeier's Smile. Actually, somebody actually told me once that Smile, that Fights was like Smile, only with violence and the N-word instead of dental work. And I'm like, yeah.
Okay. All right. That is an interesting niche category to occupy. Like Smile, but ...
But with violence and the N-word. So
yeah.
Yeah, so like it's kind of, so like those books I think would like if I were on a panel with anybody, it would be those three people, I think.
Fantastic. Georgia or Sophie, do any particularly come to mind for the two of you?
Go ahead, Georgia.
Yeah, I'm terrible with this on the spot question asking, but it means that I'll go to the most obvious thought, though, is probably because it's very strong, which was just Epileptic by David B. I was actually on a panel with him a couple of years ago, and I really couldn't find a way to express myself about it. But
and for those unfamiliar, this is the story of his brother's epilepsy and his family's not necessarily positive reaction to it.
No, but very, I mean, the thing I think I love about it, and that I'm just maybe realizing later on, like I wouldn't have recognized this when I first read it, but it's a story about someone coping with something that they don't understand, that isn't being understood by anyone very well at the time. Like we treat epilepsy extremely differently now. So I feel connected to that narrative in that we're always constantly learning more about our unconscious biases and prejudices. And from the perspective of a child, that stuff isn't really clear or doesn't make sense except for the most immediate emotional truth of it. And his way of exposing like an internal world of his childhood was just beautiful, like bringing his imaginary adventures to life and having that coincide with how he imagines his brother's health struggle. And then, I mean, I would now look at that and say like that was probably a sort of like secondary trauma experience for him, just like, you know, not being the person suffering, but watching it and being traumatized by watching it, and like seeing his resilience as a kid, just dealing with it because he decided to draw imagined realities for himself. Like that really made me want to do the same thing.
Fantastic. Sophie, did you want the opportunity to chime in on this?
Sure. I mean, I've definitely been very inspired by memoir cartoonists, and the two folks who I think I return to the most are Gabrielle Bell and John Porcellino. And they're very quotidian cartoonists, generally speaking. And I would say that although my book has some like adventure elements, it's very much dealing with sort of internal sort of psychological and emotional struggle and trying to work through some things. And I think that both of those cartoonists have, you know, just sort of helped me a lot in my life in terms of my own anxiety and depression, and just seeing them sort of write through it. I think it was useful to me, but also gave me permission, I feel, to say, okay, I'm going to tell a story and it's not going to be the most profound thing, but I think that those stories are valuable as well. So that's
question.
You know.
Yeah. We have a nicely semi-democratic ask a question function here. We have questions that have been posed by the audience members, and some of them have been upvoted. So I'd like to at least get to some of the top most upvoted questions right now, beginning with one from Braden Lamb. Hi, Braden. Braden asks, if I wanted to explore a memory from my own life by making a comic, what would be some good starting steps? Questions I could ask myself about the events and the feelings. Would anyone like to offer just what are the grounding or initial steps you took? I know some of you had to wrestle with whether you were going to fictionalize this further or whether you were going to put yourself as much as you could represent yourself front and center. Is that early in the process? Are there other steps in the process that you would necessarily have someone like Braden ask themselves first?
I would say that just thinking about how it all makes sense chronologically. If it's part of a larger narrative, you want to think about story structure and story arc and character development. You want to think about all of those things. But if it's just, I say just, but that's a lot. So like, I would just first start with like writing down, like, I always think that, so I always tell people to write just in general, not because we're writers, because we're cartoonists. We do both of those things simultaneously. So the words and the pictures come together. And they dance in a really specific way where you can't step on the other one. But I think writing actually helps you formulate the ideas. It's kind of like writing a list before you go to the grocery store. If you sit down and write a list before they go to the grocery store, it's actually cementing the idea in your head. So there are things that you don't have to look at the list for, but then there are things that you should go back to the list and look at. And I think writing in this context will help just give you a sense of what you're thinking about, because you might write stuff randomly that you didn't even know about, like just writing in general. Like when I was writing fights, I was trying to think about how to make this not like and just like this incredible, painful, trauma after trauma after trauma. And so I sat down and I started thinking, like, let me think about some things that happened that were good. Because I remember some really great things that happened as being a kid. Like I always tell people, I wish I could have figured out how to tell you what summer smelled like the first day of summer after getting out of school, and just like opening the door to the apartments that I lived in and just like smelling it. And just like, there's just something about that smell that I wish I could bring back. And I wish I could draw that. Right. So like writing that down. And then I wrote this whole section about, there's a man named Mr. Charles who was in the book, who was really kind to me. And then writing about that, I realized that Mr. Charles wasn't extra special kind. He was just a regular person. I just ran into somebody who actually treated children like children should be treated, right? Not anything special that anybody would do. It was just like, he was just a normal person. And so like that actually gave me some really good places to start thinking about it. So just write about it. And you don't have to like include any of that writing, but just write about it, because something about the process of writing cements things in your idea, in your mind, that wouldn't happen if you're just thinking out loud.
Okay, so free writing and associative writing, just to have a log of it. I like that. I like that a lot. Sophie or Georgia, is there anything you would advise or add to that?
Yeah, I try to, I think free writing is definitely where I would start. I try to set like time limits kind of for myself so that it can just come and not be worrying about actually using what I'm making. I also personally try to leave structure out of it when I'm starting. I'm just trying to get stuff on the page, and then I can figure out, okay, is there a structure here? And what might I need to add? What memories would I need to add? Or in the case of autofiction, what scenes would I need to add that would set up this scene later? So yeah, and I try to sort of like, some of the scenes and the contradictions are scenes where I was like, wow, when that happened, I was profoundly embarrassed, or like it was based on a moment where I felt so embarrassed, and I was like, okay, well, I have to write that down and see what comes out of that. And, maybe I feel differently about it now and can see some of the differences in it. And then I take that and I usually make like a grid. Like my book is like a 6-panel grid, and I'll pick certain sentences sometimes if I want to go straight from like the writing to making a comic. And, if I'm doing something narration, I put stuff in, or I just sort of start sketching in the grids. So that's how I would start. Yeah.
I'm actually trying to, in the other window, just bring up an example, a visual example from your book there. But I, of course, have scrolled in the wrong direction. So that's Not going to help anyone at all. There we go. Much better. Georgia, did you want to add anything to this, or does that cover your own process?
Well, I think if you're thinking about making a story from your own life, there would be different approaches depending on if there's a story that you already have in mind. I was just imagining that question could have come from a place where someone was thinking, yeah, I have this thing and I really want to write about it. How would I get that done? And I think Sophie and Joel fully covered that. But then I was also thinking some people start writing about their own lives, but without that certainty about what the story is going to be or about the things that they want to talk about. And in that case, doing a little bit of like journal comicking, that the way that actually someone like Gabrielle Bell or John Porcellino have done, where it's just something that's continuously happening, and then you get to watch the very beautiful arc of their life just taking place and the narrative emerging from that. So you don't have to have like a solid idea or a plan or even a topic that you really want to dig into, but writing about your life can be also just a sort of practice every week or something. Just, I'm going to make a few panels about what happened or what I was thinking about, or like strong memories and things will come out of that. So you might find a bigger topic and go from there. But yeah, it can start with a plan, or it can start with just letting things roll.
We've had one question shoot. I love this as a moderator, so I don't have to pick and choose. We've had one question shoot to the very top of the upvoting, and that is, what is it like, and how do you deal with meeting strangers who know so much personal stuff about your life? What is it like to not only have put that out there, and wonderful that it's being read and engaged with, but then you come face to face with this very person who knows what was in your book, who feels as though they might know you in some way. How do you deal with that? Do you welcome
That's
it?
weird.
Is it weird? Yeah, okay, it's weird. It's weird. Got it.
I mean, it's weird. You know, like my cousin said that I'm low-key famous once. And I was just like, okay, whatever, right? She's like, you're low-key famous. It's a weird, I just don't think about it anymore. But I remember earlier when Strange Fruit came out, like people would send me stuff, like people would send me messages in the middle of the night or something, like on Facebook or in email. So it was crazy that people would do that. I don't know. Like, I have to say that when I first published, when Fights first went out into the world, it was absolutely terrifying, right? Like it is unvarnished. Like I did not leave anything out. Like I was a bully. I was a terrible kid. Like I was quote unquote a terrible kid. I did things that some people probably write about. Like this was my bullet, right? They actually probably spent time thinking about. And so like that was out there in the world. But I think for the most part, people have been really positive about how about it. So it's weird, but I mean, after you talk to a couple of people about it, it's kind of like, yeah, you just get used to it. I mean, you don't know everything. Like I didn't tell them every single thing, but like the oddest thing is like people are like, do you still remember like any of the raps that your rap group made up? And I'm like, absolutely. I actually was asked in an interview, would you do some of it? Like, would you do some of that? And I'm like, no.
Oh, okay.
That's not going to happen. And then there are people who I run into who I know who can pick out people from the books. Like they can say, I know exactly who that person is. And I never confirm nor deny that, but they were like, I know that is such and such. And I'm like, well, not completely. It's a little weird. I would say it's a little weird. I don't know how you guys feel about it, but it's a little weird.
I know, Georgia, I had to reach out to you for some academic scholarly thing, and I had read Dumb, and it left me with at least an impression that I knew something about you. So I was in that fan experience approaching you. I don't want you to answer this in terms of me. That time that Dave Lewis contacted me, we will leave that unspoken. But yeah, Sophie, Georgia, does that resonate for you also?
Yeah, I actually have mostly answered this question in the past by saying my books aren't personal. They're not.
Oh.
Which is interesting because I think I need to revise that. Like, they are personal. They're very specifically personally about things that have happened to me, but I don't feel exposed when people know about things that have happened or things that I've done or things that I've thought. I feel most exposed when I'm feeling those things and someone's there with me in that moment. So the book itself, it's so many layers removed, and people, I know, they read and understand things through their own lens, and I'm not responsible for their lens. So it doesn't really give me that feeling that I am known or that there's something personal here that I should be uncomfortable with.
Even if they claim to know you, or even if they're under the impression that they know you?
No, because I mean,
Okay.
if someone's under the impression that they know me, I know that that's not true.
Okay.
But it's interesting because if someone is having that feeling, then what I see in that is, oh, this really spoke to your experience. You feel like you know because you connected with it. And I know you don't know me because maybe we're speaking for the first time, maybe we've never spoken and I'm getting an email. And the fact that someone wants to tell me that is enough for me to understand, oh, you really connected to this. That's special and important, and I'm glad you read it. I don't feel like it crosses any lines with me, though. And with actually speaking to Joel's comment about, how people are identifying, like, I know that person that you wrote about, I think that makes me more nervous, that I would create something that a stranger or someone who I didn't think about reading the book would then make a judgment or have an impression on a third party who never decided to write a book. That makes me nervous. However, it's somewhat unavoidable sometimes. And I think the thing I'm working on now is going to include a lot more of that I have to negotiate and find a way that feels fair and safe, but still true to my experience. That's going to be a more delicate project. So ask me in a year.
Okay.
I might have a different answer.
I'm gonna break my own rules here. Sophie, I absolutely want to hear your answer to this if there's one you want to offer. But I am going to quote someone from the chat. I said I'd ignore the chat, but I'm actually going to quote someone. This is Lou Clark saying, "Oh, the disconnect from a past self and from the creative representation of that past self. That makes a lot of sense. A useful reframe. If people feel as though they know you, rightly or wrongly, from your work, it is work that you've done in the past on your not present person. Maybe it informs your present person, but I think I really liked that point from the chat, so I am stealing it. Okay.
Very nice. Yeah.
Sophie, when people think they know you or feel that they understand you from your work, what's your reaction to that?
I honestly, I tend to believe it.
Okay.
To a degree. I feel like I really kind of bare my soul in my comics. I'm a little bit of an oversharer, like if you know me in person, and I kind of bring that to my comics sometimes. Even if this one is autofiction and I'm not using narration to explicitly tell you a lot of what the character is feeling, I feel like I say a lot of things in my, even though I just said I'm an oversharer, in my work, I share a lot of things that wouldn't come up in day-to-day conversation.
Sure.
And I do feel like the weirder thing is actually when folks that I have a relatively superficial relationship with read the work, because then it's like, oh, okay, now you know we have this relationship, but now you kind of know this other side of me, and you know something that I care deeply about or that I spend a lot of time with. And so I do think whether or not, you did this and now I know all about your life, I don't think that's the thing where I get the sense of them really knowing me. It's like they engaged with something that I really deeply engage with. And so to some degree, they know me quite deeply suddenly then. And so I feel like also when I meet somebody at a show, I feel like a mice or whatever, the conversation quickly tends to go, to something kind of deeper than a lot of my day-to-day relationships, generally go. And so I haven't had a lot of experiences so far that have made me, really uncomfortable. But I'm willing to believe that those will happen, but generally, I think that it leads to interesting conversation, and whether or not their impression is exactly who I am, I do think they know actually a fairly deep part of me.
Nice. No, that there's, and I appreciate that that's a rather distinct answer from what our other two panelists gave. I mean, and I like that we're representing the different ways in which graphic memoir and autofiction can function. We are getting close to the end of our allotted time. There is another question that came up here. It's a little meta, but it's a little meta, but I'm going to pull out the piece of it that I don't think we've directly gone after yet. And that is, Joel alluded to this. Has anyone included as a character in your work come to you with a positive or negative reaction to your portrayal of them and their actions? Now, I think one of you commented that they recognized someone in the work, but has someone that you have portrayed or amalgamated in your work come to you about their portrayal? And you don't have to say who. I'm just wondering what the interaction was like.
In fights, the real people are me and my mom. The people that are not amalgams: me, my mom, my wife, and Mike, my best friend, who's in prison for double murder. And his siblings had fights, and they both reached out to me and said that they appreciated the way that I portrayed him, which because, like I said, Mike's in prison for double murder. It's not he did it. It's not like he was accused of something that he didn't do. But also, when talking to him and like dealing with him, if you all dealt with him, you like he's actually a really great person, like outside of this thing that happened, which is a complicated thing to say. And I think that his siblings have come to me and they were like, I really appreciate the way you portrayed him. Like I haven't seen him in years, but like they sent me messages through social media and was like, I really appreciate the way you did that. And then the people that kind of recognize other people, those people are those people are amalgams, and so they're like they're exaggerations. So I took some really terrible things in this one and took some terrible things in that one and put them together. So people don't necessarily recognize them, and I don't think that the people that they actually are mostly would actually recognize them because of narcissism and ego. So I don't think they would that could never be me, right?
Okay.
So that's what I've had happen.
And Georgia, Sophie, any experiences there?
No, it's never happened to me.
Okay. So at the next Mice, we want you to check back in and tell us if it has happened since then.
Yeah, I'm my next project. That's exactly where I'm expecting to start getting recognitions like that, but we'll just find out.
And Sophie, I didn't want to steamroll you. Did you have that experience at all?
Yeah, I mean, not with this book, but I mean, with War Streets and Houses. My last book, short thing, What is a Glacier? There's a big part in it about my ex-girlfriend, but I actually showed it to her before publication. So I tend to, if there's somebody who I still have some kind of relationship with and I'm going to write about them, I tend to talk about it first with them and show them what I've done and try to be open to their feedback. So that generally doesn't come as a surprise. But when I was making like journal comics and living in Montreal, I would sell the comics at, expos and these festivals and stuff. And so my friends would, there was a lot of times where I didn't even really think about drawing somebody, but I was drawing in a pretty vague way, but people would see themselves. But generally there wasn't much that was, sort of controversial there. So, but in War Streets and Houses, yeah, there were moments where people were like, oh, that was me. That was a crazy thing that happened, so.
Well, I'm pleased to say in sort of a naughty way that there were questions we couldn't get to today, which only means that this topic remains an interesting one, remains one that we might want to discuss further on Twitter, or you might want to try to contact again through social media, not personally, our panelists themselves after having read their works, which you can purchase through Mice as well. It all remains to me to say thank you to Sophie, to Joel, to Georgia, and to all of you for joining us for this first in a month of Mice panels. It was terrific getting to walk through all this, get to know you all a little better beyond your comics, which I already know you very well from. Thank you three again very much, and I am going to hand it back to our hosts.
Perfect. Hello.
Hello.
Thank you all so much for being on this panel, and thank you to our audience for coming. We really appreciate it. To order our panelists' books from Paper Asylum, which is a local independent comic shop, please find links on our website. You can click the button below on your screen. Nice green button for you there. And this session is part of the month of Mice, which is a month of free comics programs, including panel discussions and workshops. For a full list of sessions, visit miceexpo.org. That's MICEXPO.org, or click that button again and it'll bring you to our schedule. And check out our fundraising raffle where you can win cool prizes like a tote bag of books from Drawn in Quarterly or a Mice sketchbook. Now stay tuned to watch our Creator Showcase, which is a virtual exhibition floor where you can discover dozens of brand new self-published comics. Thank you all again, and yeah, let's move into that Creator Showcase. Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Bye. Thank you.
Kill me.
Everybody freeze.
Sorry.
It's the end of an 80s show where you have to all freeze with the last scene.
All right, yeah, everyone's gone. We're gone. Okay, great. Thank you so much. If you would like to join the Creator Showcase, you may. It's if you go to the top of your screen, you can toggle into that. There's like a little button at the top.
I see it.
Yeah, but otherwise, thank you so much. And I'm just going to wait and make sure that I can stop this broadcast.
Thank you all so much. I'll take care.
Good seeing y'all. Good seeing you, Sophie. Take care.
Yeah, you too. See you guys.